All right, I hope we're alive. So today is Hei Teves, the day of seforim, and the Kolel, Rabbi already mentioned what the Rabbi said that year. Shortly afterwards, Hei Teves, not to focus on the Ma'ira D'Anasoyan, which is a davar she'im bei mamish, v'meila l'loi kol te'elas v'adarava. The Rabbi said then that the kol hachayas v'heslavas tzarich liyas, beginning with learning sifrei v'kisvei achsidus upshita b'hakdamas limud nigla de Torah. Last year, for those who remember, or those who saw, we spoke about we spoke on Hei Teves on how seforim intersect with Gneva and halacha. That was essentially the theme of the shiur. But this year we're going to be makbid even more to stay away from anything that has even the remotest whiff of shlila. We're going to focus directly on the mile of seforim. So specifically what I wanted to speak about is the question as to whether the reality today, the Metzias today, the way seforim have come along ever since they began writing Torah Sheba'al Peh, and then more chiburim were composed along the way, more manuscripts, till the invention of the printing press, and after that as well, many developments till we find ourselves in today's day and age. So the question is, do we see that this has any effect on halacha? Now there are a number of potential angles here, but what I'm going to focus on is the big one, which is what effect does this have on Hilchos Talmud Torah? I assume we all know familiar generally with the Alter Rebbe's shitta about the mitzvah of zikaron, the isser of shikchas HaTorah and Hilchos Talmud Torah. Certainly hope we all are familiar with his work. As we know, Hilchos Talmud Torah, unlike the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, which hews a lot closer to regular Shulchan Aruch and Nois Kelim, Hilchos Talmud Torah is a much more original and independent work, and there's a lot in there that's completely new, novel. The Alter Rebbe has a lot of novel ideas and mahalchim there, and being masber, the chazals and the halachas. And the Alter Rebbe essentially makes a seder from the Snai and the many Mekayros related to these issues, like as if he were one of the Rishonim. Now the Alter Rebbe actually has something pretty direct to say about this question, about whether seforim have an impact on these halachas, and he seems to reject it. Now before we get to what the Alter Rebbe says, if not for the Alter Rebbe, or at least before we actually take a look at the Alter Rebbe, I would want to say, and b'chlai, I think sometimes this is helpful and useful when you want to learn something be'iyum. Sometimes it's kedai before you delve into it to try to ask yourself before, what do I think about it? Be ma'ayin a little bit yourself, what your instinct says, how you might think the halacha works, how you might think the yesodis work. And then once you have your own idea, your own conception, then when you're ma'ayin b'fnim, so then it resonates more, you have a stake in the game, and then you can see whether what you thought is borne out or not, and why. So we're going to try to do that. Before we start, let's just come up with a potential theory as to maybe how this halacha ought to work, and then we'll see what the Alter Rebbe says. What I'm saying might be influenced by a more contemporary understanding of memory and things like that. L'chayra, what is memory? Right? So if you look it up in Wikipedia, the first line for memory is the faculty of the brain by which data or information is encoded, stored, and retrieved when needed. That's the definition. Sounds good. But when you define it that way, l'chayra, we can start opening our minds to other possibilities, other options for storage and retrieval. I'm trying to store information and retrieve it. If that's essentially what memory is, maybe I can do that in other ways, some non-traditional ways. So let me start off with a fantastical scenario. Let's say in 10 years from now, you'll be able to have hybrid memory. You have your natural implanted memory, plus you have external memory. You can maybe put in an SD card, something like that, and maybe you'll be able to have your brain interact with that and access information, store information, access information. Right? So let's say that was possible. Maybe you could even download a lot of information in one shot and just open it up. So would we say then that you still, when it comes to learning Torah, you're still mechuyev to memorize and learn all the information the old-fashioned way? Or would we be open to the possibility that, hey, if you have a shortcut, you have an easier way of doing it, maybe we'd be open to the possibility that this also will work. I think many of us are most likely to accept that as possible, halachically. So let's advance from there to a more realistic scenario at the moment. Let's say someone is sitting and learning a sugya and went through the sugya, be'iyun, and he wrote it up along the shima, went through all the details, he wrote it all up. Now he takes it, it's in his notebook, he puts the notebook aside, and he doesn't return to the subject, he doesn't review the subject for a while. A while later, the subject comes up again, doesn't necessarily remember all the details in his brain, but he has a notebook on the shelf, he pulls the notebook off the shelf, and he's able to refresh his memory. And for the sake of, at this point, let's say that while he's reading it, he feels like, oh, I'm remembering, I remember all of this. Couldn't necessarily sum it at all from memory, but now that I'm reading it, yeah, this is the sugya as I remember it, I remember going through this. Why is that so different than sitting for, not every memory jumps to mind instantly, sometimes you have to sit and think for 10 minutes. What's the difference between thinking and taking a piece of paper? It's stored externally. Right? You have storage, you have retrieval, more or less meets the definitions of memory. And if we're willing to accept that, then we can go even further and say, what if he reads it and says, I don't remember any of this, but it's my handwriting. I guess I must have gone through all the stuff, and this is what I must have thought at the time. Does that also count as stored and retrieved? And if we accept that there's a possibility there, let's go further. What if you just go through many seforim without chazara, but it's enough, you remember enough that in the future, whenever a question comes up, you're going to know which sefer to pull off the shelf. It's not your sefer, it's someone else's sefer, but you sort of offloaded the task of remembering it to that sefer. You know exactly where it is. Instead of your notebook, it's someone else's sefer. And even beyond that, the next level would be, right, we know, like we mentioned, computers, you have files that you actually open and close and reopen, but you can also just download a ton of files that you never opened, and then you open them at some point in the future. So what if you just memorized maybe the table of contents of a ton of seforim, and that's enough to help you find what you need when you need it. Right? How much further can we go? What if you didn't memorize the table of contents, but with computers today and the power of search, which is a pretty recent development, you're pretty confident that you're able to summon what you need anyway within a minute or two. You didn't even have to bother to go through memorize anything. Well, seems like there's something to discuss here. This is the idea to have in mind when you look at the Alter Rebbe. So now, if you look at the Alter Rebbe, you want to see how it fits in with what the Alter Rebbe says. So I gave some of you copies. Bit of an arichas there. We have to make our way through it. So I'm going to start from Seif Aleph, even though it's not in the papers. So the context is, Perek Aleph was about the chiv of a father teaching his son. Perek Beis begins and says, what if your father didn't teach you anything? So then you have your own chiv to learn. And you shouldn't start, if you're starting off as an adult, don't start off like a child. First with Mikra, then Mishnah, then Talmud, then Chumash to Mikra. Don't follow that. Right away, right when you start, be Meshalish Zman Lemidasei, divide into three. Mikra, Mishnah the Alter Rebbe defines as halachis psukas bli taimim. And nowadays, we would define Mishnah, the Alter Rebbe says, as being Tur and Shulchan Aruch. That would be the Shlish Mishnah. And then the Shlish Talmud. What's the Shlish Talmud? Nowadays, the Alter Rebbe says that could be like learning the Rosh and the Beis Yosef, because the Rosh is the Taimim. Well, the Rosh came before the Torah, the Beis Yosef came after the Torah, but from either angle, you see the halachas, barichas Yosef with the Yesod, the Taimim. The Alter Rebbe clarifies that There's a fourth level. The fourth level is actually sitting and learning be'iyun. You're being ma'ayin yourself. That the Alter Rebbe says you shouldn't do at all. That's only after you finished learning all the halachas psukas b'tamein. So that you shouldn't be doing at all. But you should be doing shlish mishnah, which is halachas psukas, and shlish talmud, which is tamein. And the Alter Rebbe says where mikra and agadita and kabbalah fit in, which category, but they all fit in. Then in Sif Beis, the Alter Rebbe clarifies and says, if you're starting out as an adult. But if you actually succeeded, you actually managed to absorb all the information, so then you don't have to keep on doing this, because you already chazered everything so much. Hei Teves and we're going to get to this in a moment. But that was the goal you reached. So then, you just go through Chumash, Mishnah, you have a Seder just to go through it every now and then to refresh it. But now you can sit and learn Be'iyun. Haven davar mitech davar, ledames davar, ledavar, lechadesh chedushi halachas rabbis. That all comes once you've completed the task of shenechkak Hei Teves b'zechreinu kol ha'torah sheb'chsav shebal peh kum. Now we get to Seif Gimel, the Alter Rebbe's shitta regarding zikaron and shikha. The Alter Rebbe says, "L'divrei hakoil." This is in reference to a debate about something else previously. Dovid HaKoil, B'tchilas limudei shel adam, when you begin learning, assuming you begin learning as an adult, Mikra Mishnah Talmud, every day. It's not enough to learn once or twice or three times. Tzorech lachzer kol echad pamim rabbis ma'oid, HaKoil afi koyach zechreinu shel adam kadei sheyiskar Hei Teves. You have to memorize, you have to repeat it as many times as your memory requires, necessitates for you to actually remember it. And Mishnah and Talmud, Tzarech lachzer leim mekifle kiflayim, takes even more repetition. Now the Rebbe says, "Vayter chayiv u'min ha'torah lachzer leim kol kach, al shetahei mishnasei sedura u'shgura b'fiv kol kach, be'inyan shem yishalenu adam ez dvar halacha mima shalama." What is the even habaychen? What's the test? If someone asks you a halacha that you learned, yuchal ha'ashav leim miyad asar nemuter b'li gumgum, you can answer him on the spot. That's the halachic hagdara of the idea and zikaron, the way the Alter Rebbe is explaining it. And here comes the first reference to seforim nowadays. The Alter Rebbe says, "V'lochin gam achshav shenichtav ha'torah shebal peh v'yachal la'ayin b'seforim." Now the Torah shebal peh is written, and now we could just look things up in seforim, seemingly. You're not mekayim v'shinantam. Me'achas shemegamgim l'shoyeloi ve'ena yimeshav lo miyad. Because you're saying, and I have to look, and it takes a second. Which you mentioned earlier, it has to be clear, it should be not a moment's hesitation. So what's this lashon b'yachal ayin b'svarim? It doesn't mention anything about shikha. Later he's going to mention, you can look in a sefer and remind yourself. Here he doesn't mention shikha, so either he means you didn't learn it yet, or at any rate, he's not getting into the definition of shikha, just together of v'shinantam. And the Kasalka Daitach, the Havamina was that it's good enough to be able to look it up, and we're saying no. Then the Alter Rebbe says, as a result, how much can you actually cover in this way? It shouldn't bother you. It's not your problem. He says, back then they had to learn 100 times. And that's where these Lashonis in Chazal about Shena Pirka Mea Pa'amim. Then the Alter Rebbe mentions Svarim a second time. Here the Alter Rebbe says it did change something. Now that we have it all written, that's the reason why we gave you a discount. You don't actually have to repeat it 101 times. Because we assume that somehow having the sefer, having the writing in front of you, we assume makes it easier to memorize quicker. That seems to be the part. But the result didn't change. You're still mechuyev to remember it just as well as ever. Note also that earlier in Hilchos Lamed and Perek Aleph, Sevav, the Alter Rebbe also mentioned something about this. The Alter Rebbe said, "Shekol ha'torah shebal peh hiksuva lefaneinu, ein tzorech lisker melamed lebnoi shilamdenu kol ha'torah shebal peh." That changed the nature of Hilchos Melamdim as well. Amal, they had to teach the whole Torah, the Seder that he describes. But now he just has to give him Shiurim and Gemara, more like along the lines of what we are familiar with today. We'll get to that. We'll get back to that soon. that's another example where the Alter Rebbe is acknowledging the impact of seforim. And also Nilchos Pesach, right in the beginning, Siman Reish Mem Hesef Gimel, but Deiras Halalu, the Alter Rebbe says, She'eina Chacham Shein L'Talmid of Halachas, the Shabbos Hagadol Drasha isn't the Halachas anymore, V'Shakol Kasav V'Sefer. So we see to some extent, seforim do change, at least the manner of learning, but it seems like the Alter Rebbe holds that it doesn't change the outcome. Now in Sif Daled, we get to the Alter Rebbe Shita and Shikha. V'chol HaShecheach Davar Echad B'Mishnasei Machmas Shlei Chazer Al Limudei Karoi Mal Olav HaKasav Kilu Mischayev B'Nafshoy. That's the Mishnah. And Gam Over B'Lav Shel Torah. Alter Rebbe gets into the details. So it's not just a positive, V'Shinantam, that should be Mechudadim, they should be answered on the spot, but there's also HaShecheach is Mischayev B'Nafshoy Over and Alav. And here comes the third time, the third Isyachsus. The Alter Rebbe says, V'Gam Achshav. Shenichtav HaTorah Sheba'al Peh V'Yuchal La'ayim Esvarim Mashashachach. Here the Alter Rebbe adds Mashashachach, that L'chayra Seforim can help you retrieve the memory that you had. Ein Zamoyel Klum, it's completely unhelpful. It can be Ad Shashachach, Over B'Lav, Kaidim She'ayin, you're over before you had a chance to look it up. Bam, you're over. Right, so it seems like Alter Rebbe is rejecting this idea of being able to retrieve information from elsewhere. And Alter Rebbe brings a raya, just like back then they were over the law of the Chayr, back then they shouldn't have been over the law either, because they could have always gone back to the Rabbi. Without seforim, it could have always gone back to what's the source of the information? The Rabbi. So you can always go back to your Rabbi and ask him again. If that were the case, so then you should never be over. From the fact that you were over then, when you can ask your Rabbi, so the same applies to seforim. And B'chlal the Alter Rebbe says, Mitzvus HaTorah le'tishtanam b'shini ha'doros le'yachil v'le'yomer dosa le'lamim. The halacha can't change. Of course, that itself is its own discussion. We just saw a moment ago that something or a few things did seem to change. What could change? What can change? You can make chilukim, or on some level you could say that whatever the Alter Rebbe holds didn't change. You have to say it didn't change. But we're not going to get into that separate discussion. Now, l'chayra, this may be raising some questions about what people are doing halacha l'mayis. So the Alter Rebbe seemingly continues and addresses different tainas, Siv Vav, Siv Zayin, and Siv Ches. And Siv Vav, the Alter Rebbe says that this is only talking about k'shachach machmas atzlus. But if it's machmas oinso, if your taina is, what do you mean? I couldn't, I wasn't able, I'm busy, I need parnasa. Then, eina mischai b'nafshe v'gam eina over b'lav. It's excluding oinus. Okay. Zayin. And what if this a problem? The Mishnah says tak yachol tak v'ala mishnasai. It's not a problem. What's tak v'ala mishnasai? So that's going to be part of the discussion here. The Alter Rebbe says that it's too difficult. His mind isn't really wrapping around it, so it just keeps on escaping him, and the review isn't helping. So in that case, even though you're not technically an onus, you could maybe just keep on learning it in perpetuity, endlessly. But the Torah doesn't need you to do that, to focus on the things that are too difficult for you, that you shouldn't forget them. Adarabah, you should try to focus on what you could successfully remember. And don't worry about the things you can't, because anyway, you're focusing on other parts of Torah. It's not like you're wasting time. But then, Alter Rebbe comes to Sif Ches, and there's a taina that Alter Rebbe is not mekabel. If you come and just say that I'm a shakchen gadol b'tiva v'teilalatoi, very forgetful, that even if I say it 101 times, pa'amamein misper, I'm never going to be kind of the information long term. It's going to stick for a while, a day, a week, a month, and then I'm going to slowly forget. It's going to seep out of my mind. Alter Rebbe says that's not a good taina. Lo yuchal lifter nafshe milav zeh, umitzvos v'shinantam. Because it's Shabbos l'chol nefesh miYisrael. We can't have a subjective Torah, everyone having their own Torah. You're chayav and you're patur because your nature is different. Kol echad chayav liskut different Torah b'liba k'fi yacholtei v'asagas koyach zichreine ma'at from harbe. So the Alter Rebbe now comes along and gives what you might call a radical seder limud. So v'azeh amru lo yalech amalecha ligmar. So if you're a shakchen gadol, so let's say if you learn Perek Echad B'Yayim and you chazer 100 times, Kol Yom Kuloi, it's only going to stick in your memory for a month, Al Derech Mashal, and if you don't review it again, you'll start forgetting it. So that you should craft your Seder Limud around your memory span, your capacity for memory. So take a Perek and chazer it as many times as you need. And then the next day, now your cheshbon is that you remember it for a month. So now I have 29 days that I can still learn other things because I didn't forget today's parak yet. So for Shleishim Yoim, you learn something new each day and you memorize it. And that way, each thing is going to last you for 30 days. By the time you get to the end of the 30 days, now you have to chazer everything that you learned already until now to make sure it doesn't escape your memory. Once you finish chazara, if you have still some time left till the end of the next month, now you have time to cover some more material. So you fill that time with new material. Then at the end of that month, you chazer everything from the 2 months, because everything lasts only a month. And you keep on doing that and keep on doing that until the chazar of everything you know itself fills an entire month. And then you just keep on repeating that forever. That's the Alter Rebbe's response to someone who says, I'm a shakchen and I can't remember long term. Until Adarach Mashal, Aza Yisha B'Chazar Azu, Kol HaChedesh Kula Yad Sheyachzir Al Kol Limud Shalaman Ad Ata, V'chen Yasel Oilam Midei Chedesh B'Chad Shei L'Achzir Talmud Al Harishenis. The end of Sifches. That means that now you're basically, for the rest of your life, you're restricted to a month's worth of material, that material. Av Shenimtza, that Shlo Yuchal Lumid Aleida Kol Yom V'Rak Kadei Mash Yuchal Achzir B'Chedesh Echad Lo Yachash. It shouldn't bother you. He says, back then you talk about people that only knew one Masechta, 2 Masechtas. Back then without the benefit of seforim. They made a cheshbon that they should probably focus on what they're able to achieve, so they focused on what they knew. Then the Alter Rebbe adds in Siftes, and we'll conclude our Finim portion here, that if you're a person like this, you're a shakchen, you can't aspire to learn Kol HaTorah Kula, and you're only focusing on what you're able to cover in that amount of time according to that system. So the Alter Rebbe says your focus should therefore be on limud ha'mevei lidei ma'aseh, the most important, most relevant practical halachas, to mekayim them kol chasan, and to be nizer from isurim, especially the type of things that you can't always run and ask a rav, or if you don't learn it, you won't even know that there was a question. So what is that? And learn those halachas, taka, Mishnah and Talmud, learn the halachas, learn the Rosh B'S Yosef, l'fachas, and assuming that you can't advance beyond that, so you should stick to that. And then the Alter Rebbe says, even if you do have a good memory and you do have she'ifas for Kol HaTorah Kula, you should still start with these. Then the Alter Rebbe gets back to Agadas and Musar and Tanakh. So it seems that's the end of looking B'Fnim. So it seems like the Alter Rebbe seemingly rejected out of hand all the ideas that all the theories we were suggesting earlier. So first of all, one could ask why. And Lahoyer, that the Alter Rebbe is really the Baal HaDvarim here. He's the Machadash. He's the one who's taking it to these extremes, so to speak. He's the one asking about what about seforim, what factor do seforim nowadays have? And l'chayr, we do not find such clear hagdaras before the Alter Rebbe. And in fact, that if the Rambam turned the Shulchan Aruch, for example, they all were completely mashmit. They completely omitted the whole din of Vishinanta, Mechudadin, which is a big plank in the Alter Rebbe's system. It's not even mentioned in any of those Makairas. The Alter Rebbe brought it back. So it's really all here in the Alter Rebbe. We have to figure out what the Alter Rebbe is trying to say. And the main question, of course, is that it doesn't seem like anyone is following this Lamaisa. So we have to stand up for ourselves somewhat. Usually we want to take the Alter Rebbe shit to the end, but here, we have to find some middle ground here. So the first makkah, when you're learning Hilchos Talmud Torah, the first place you look when you want to be ma'ayin in these inyanim, of course, is in the beer, the multi-volume beer of Rav Mordechai Shmuel Ashkenazi on Hilchos Talmud Torah. He has one sefer, one krach per parak on average. Right? So Rav Mordechai Shmuel Ashkenazi, the Rebbe Per Chabad, he went through this entire sugya. I believe this was back in the Mems and the Nuns with the Rebbe's encouragement, if I'm not mistaken. And he literally goes through every line and the comments and every psik and every tag. For anyone who's familiar with the seforim, knows, and of course that also means that when you're actually looking for something on a topic you're interested in, that means having to crawl through many dozens, if not hundreds of pages to find different ha'aras. So if you look in Sif Daled, the Alter Rebbe says, and the Alter Rebbe shoots down that Kasal Kadaitach. So Rav Ashkenazi has a few ha'aras. If you look in ha'ara 28 Aleph, so he's Medayak and the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe said, "V'yuchal la'ayin b'svarim ha'sheshachach." Interesting. The Alter Rebbe could have said, "V'yuchal lihizacher b'svarim ha'sheshachach." Could have made it clear that you're reminding yourself. So it could be, he says, the Kasal Kadaitach Taka was, that Taka, even when you reread the Sefer, the Kasal Kadaitach the Alter Rebbe was rejecting was that even when you look in the Sefer, it doesn't look familiar. And still I would think that maybe Yuchal Ayim Esfarim Masha Shachach comes out to them and says, no, it doesn't work. Bazoi, that can be a kula, that can work out for us. Could be, the Alter Rebbe would be Moedeh, that if you're ma'ayin in the Sefer and you feel like it's reminding you Masha Shachach, not that you're relearning it, but that you're retrieving the information, it's not familiar, you just needed to look it up to see it inside, to see it b'fnim, then maybe you're talking not over on the lav. Right now we're focusing on Sifdal, the lav. You're not over on the lav, you're not mischayev and afshin. You're only over and mischayev if when you look in the Sefer, it's still completely unfamiliar to you. And he points out that we can shtel this too, we can connect this to a discussion in Shas, different things Chazal say, shakchum, v'chazru, v'yastum, that it existed, it was forgotten, and it was brought back. Right? The Chazal come to say that don't think that certain things are only late inventions. Really, they were there all along from Matan Torah. A famous example is the Oisius Sophius. If you look in the ancient Ksav Ivri, maybe even the early Ksav Ashuri, you don't have mansapach, you don't have this concept, right? Why do 5 letters have a different shape when they're at the end of a word? Right? Interesting. It's its own topic and question. But in Ksav Ashuri today, they're there. And Chazal say, no, don't say that it's a later invention. That would be a little strange. We're writing in Sifrei Torah with these Isis. No, Shalkum B'chazir V'yasta. So Ashkenazi is mitzayim to the Iyun Yaakov, who gets into this discussion as to, does that mean we're looking at it as a davar chadash, a new thing in Torah? Or no, is the whole point to say that it's not a new thing in Torah. Because it was here all along, just because you forgot it, doesn't mean that it went away, it's still here. There's a parallel there. So Rabbi Zohar Ashkenazi is arguing, he's suggesting that even in the Alter Rebbe's seemingly very strong words, maybe there's room to taka shtel ayin, that there is a concept of zikaron through relearning, as opposed to it completely replacing your memory. That Alter Rebbe clearly rejects, but maybe if it's aiding your memory. A bit later, Rabbi Ashkenazi continues in Ha'ara 28 Gimel. He says, I wrote La'el, that it could be that if it reminds you, it's not a problem. So he's Messiah now to Gemara in Ksubis. It says in Gemara Ksubis, Kaisiv Adam Medusay al Ashtar. You're an aid to something, you can write your aidus down on a document for a future reference. And Rabbi Yechanan says, Afal pi she'ein zeichra me'atzmai. Even though, with his own memory, left his own devices, he wouldn't remember this aidus many years down the road. So Rashi says, what does that mean? Rashi says, she'ein zeichra me'atzmai, el la'acha shiraya b'shtar, nasan b'libai v'nizkar. He does remember on his own, but when he sees it, now he remembers. Shaloi nishtakach mimenu kol kach. It wasn't so forgotten. When they remind him, he remembers. But if Hitaka comes, looks at the star and says, look, it's my handwriting, I guess I wrote it, but I have no memory of this, then even this memory of Yechanan, they would be made that is not a good edus. That Achmana Amar mipiyam alei mipik savam ultimately has to be mipiyam, not mipik savam. So this doesn't really count as mipik savam because it's reminding you. So you see befedish the Gabi other in Yanim, Zakarin and Shikha and Halacha, edus, that if you can read it in the document and you remind yourself, that's mipiyam, that's not mipik savam. Unless you can't remember it at all. That's also a nice parallel to the idea we're suggesting. And then Rabbi Ashkenazi is mitzayin to the Sefer Divrei Avos I'm in Pirkei Avos, Perek Gimel, which is where some of these halachas are from. Dovid Avos is B'chach. For those familiar, wrote different seforim and halacha, Chassidus Rav, back in the 1800s. So on the Mishnah of the Stai, Rabbi Yanim, Mishum Rabbi Reimer, Kol Shechayach, Levarechad Mishnasai, Mal Olav Akasav, Kilim Mischayev and Afshay, which is one of these Mekayres that I was using. So Dovid Avos zooms in specifically on the example of writing, and maybe you can see that he's expressing himself. And he says that, I think that if you write down what was Nischadash, even if you forget it afterwards, there's no taina on you. Because if you write it in a sefer, what's the difference if it's inscribed and engraved in my heart, or if it's inscribed and engraved on a piece of paper? I outsourced it to the piece of paper taka. And he mentions that this works for edus as well. Edus, of course, we emphasize that it can't be completely forgotten. It reminds you somewhat. So Kol Shekain here. And then the Dovid Avos goes further and says, that if you wrote it down, even if, not the Gabi Edus, but the Gabi Torah, even if you ain't shum zikaron, even if the taka does not jog your memory at all, doesn't ring a bell, which would not work for Edus, but maybe here we say, the imat kirile midkar. Remind you, then you remember. Because it's not, you forget everything to one degree or another. There's always things that are distracting you. So you were counting. Your whole cheshbon was, I'm outsourcing, he doesn't use these words, but Keinu bazeh, kiven she'oimed liyas nisker al yedei harashim etzli b'ksav, ein ze b'chlal shecheach. If I plan to begin with, and I say, I'm keeping my memory over here, he's essentially saying that pretty clearly, that doesn't count as shecheach. But tzarech la'ayin oid bazeh. Then he says, Al kapanim, we don't have to go that far to say that you totally forgot, then it's still okay. It's not matzi b'shum loimet Torah, unless someone completely dropped learning. They're in learning and they completely dropped it, then your memory starts to go. But if you bleib in Torah, you're always Isaac in Torah, and you just have different tirdas, parnasa, this, that, the other thing, it's unlikely that the shikha will be that severe. It says, in fact, paradoxically, writing something down can have the effect of worse memory, right? Because you write something down, right? You can go around and memorize a shopping list, and that's annoying, Lamar Zagan. So instead, you write down on a piece of paper. Now I don't have to remember the shopping list. I have it on a paper. So paradoxically, when you write it down, you're being Mesiach daite me'advarim legamre, and you're not being kaveyet b'zichreina because you're being semech on the ksav. But it leaves a trace. It leaves a reishim, and you'll be misayed. When you reread it, you'll say, all right. And anyway, the only reason why you forgot is because you're learning other things. And then afterwards, there in the Dovid Avos, there's another keta, which is not on the Mishnayos, but whoever it was that printed it said, I found another tzettel that he wrote on this topic. And he begins and says, I wrote elsewhere about this, and he, among other things, he writes, V'yesh gamkin sveikos, sveikos b'mohus ha'shikcha. I have questions about the nature of shikha. What is shikha anyway? Shem oimed lihizachar yedei sheyitin daita liyas nisker, nidei sheni shikha, right? Start at the basic level. If you don't remember right away, but you need to sit down and you need to think for a minute, and then you're going to remember it, most of us would agree that by any reasonable definition, that counts as remembering. And what if you need someone to remind you a little bit and say, you remember the thing? Oh, right, thank you, yes, I remember. So that should also count. So then, building from there, that's how you get to these ideas. So you see that the Dovid Avos, who's going b'chalalos without the Rebbe's Yesodis, but this is where the Dovid Avos is taking it. This is what he wants to say. He focuses, like we said, especially on ksiva. By Ashkenazi, he wasn't focusing on ksiva dafka. Another thing Rabbi Ashkenazi mentions in Ha'ara 28 Daled, that there's a shita mekubetzis in Temura that says, apparently, seemingly clearly, Lishna Achrina Amri Rabbanan Agisaru Smichi, that they have shikha, so they write it down. There's this idea that you forget, you look in a sefer, so there's a makar from somewhere about this as well. So, at least specifically about ksiva, or even seforim in general. Now, l'chayra, this is all focusing on the mischaya benafshoy, the lav of shikha. It would seemingly be harder to make the case, lagabe siv gimel, v'shinantam, zikarim. bli legamgim. And Bechlal, what should our Seder Limud be? Away from the Lechatchila, based on the Alter Rebbe. It still seems like, you want to give Terutzim b'di'eh, how should we sit down to learn? But if you look in Rabbi Ashkenazi's artists earlier in Sif Gimel, and the Alter Rebbe Taka wrote, Achshav sheterish b'al pek suva l'faneinu, ein tzarech lachzor mei pa'am v'achas. That place with Alter Rebbe Taka says that it changed a little bit. You don't have to chazer 100 times. So he writes in Ara 56 Beis, he says, didn't succeed in figuring out which makar he means. I assume he means someone very recently, who said that if we go with the Yisoid Taka that we just went through from Sif Dalet, that maybe looking in a sefer can count as memory. So Abazoi, same thing here. If Teresh Peh is written in front of us, so you can remember even if you forget. So that means Milchatchila, you don't have to chazer 100 times, and L'chatchila, it's enough if you learn enough so that you'll always be able to pull the sefer off the shelf and remind yourself what you need to know. Someone wants to say that you could take it further and Taka say even L'chatchila, the Oifen Alima, the Oifen HaZikarin, it's sufficient to say that counts as Zikarin. So you need nowhere near 100. Then Rabbi Ashkenazi says, Tzarechiyam, if it stims fully with the Alter Rebbe, because later it says, the Alter Rebbe brings a raya, they could, even back then they had their Rav. So why, feed that same logic, if you tell me that it's enough that I know where to look, so why you could ask the same taina, the Alter Rebbe L'chayra would ask the same taina, why back then did they have to chazer 100 times? They could have just gone to their Rav. You could say, there it's different, because there, ultimately, your Rav isn't always around, and he won't be around forever. And once he's gone, then where's the knowledge? The knowledge, we'll get to some are marked the whole thing differently, that it's about Taka preserving the knowledge of Torah. But either way, even according to Alter Rebbe, you could say that if it's only up to your Rav, that's not a very great system, not a very reliable system. But maybe the Alter Rebbe will do Maida that today when seforim are around, and they're not under any threat of disappearing, so then that could factor in, that could be part of our cheshbon, even L'chatchila, when I'm learning, that I can always reference my seforim. Still, tzarech iyun, if it can fit in with the v'shinanta, mechudadim b'ficha, bli gimgum, that seemingly the Alter Rebbe said clearly. The question would also be, if you just isolate that it should be bli gimgum, meaning even if you remember, but you have to think, that's already begimgum. Is that mamish? How important is that? It's loyotza yedei chayvus v'shinantam. Maybe that's not the most important. If everything else is beseder, you don't have an isur shikha, and you're being mekayim the yediyas haTorah more or less, because you can always find what you need. So if you're not mekayim the shpitz of v'shinantam, so we see that he's open to this possibility. Rav Ashkenaz is open to this possibility. Even l'chatchila, the zikar and the limud might be able to base itself on this idea. Before we go on, I want to, again, say some of, boich svaras, as it were. L'chayra, there are some differences in developments, even today, versus the time of the Alter Rebbe. One big issue is that even if you were out to do what the minimum, the shakchen, who's only going to learn hilchos hatzrichos, only roi v'irachayim, and miyat yeridei, and part of it and part of mishpat. Is that even possible today, practically? Back then, the Alter Rebbe still said you can learn Shulchan Aruch, right? Because the mitzias of the world and the mitzias of halacha hadn't changed that much since the Shulchan Aruch. But look at where we are today. The amount of situations, the amount of inventions, the amount of objects we have in our daily lives, the conditions of life, the things that happen, the things that come up. The amount of halachas has, I don't know, have a number for it, but it's certainly more than doubled and quadrupled. And at this point, every single subsection of halacha has its own monograph, a whole sefer, just telling you the halachas of that area of halacha l'maisa. Right? So how, if you even were setting out to, I'm going to just learn the halachas of Roi v'Rachayim, I need to know l'maisa, and I'm going to fit it into a month's worth of something that I can review in a month. There's probably more than 30 seforim, just on those, if you want to do a sefer a day, which is probably too much to do, there's more than 30. How are you going to fit it into that time? So the Pashat HaMetzias is very different. Another svara you could, spin out is that you can call it Yedid Sadairis or whatever you want. But if not, if you put the halachic shakla aside, if someone came today and said, I want to be the most, in any tchum of knowledge, Torah or Lahavdil, anything else, and says, I want to be as efficient with my time and my skills, I want to put in the best amount of work that will provide the best results. What would we suggest? What would the strategy, what would the learning strategy be? We wouldn't tell you spend many days and hours and days and weeks memorizing stuff so you never forget anything. That doesn't seem like an efficient use of your time. Right? Try to be efficient. Try to only memorize the Yesodus, the things you need for day to day. And beyond that, try to learn systematic ideas that can sort of give you the bigger picture so you have an in to whichever subjects you have an interest in. And then beyond that, you should have the searching and the researching skills so that whenever a specific issue comes up, then you'll be able to dig down into that subject. The whole world is, and the field of knowledge, field of study is designed that way today. So psychologically, Akopanim, someone's going to come along and say, I know I have all this farm on the shelf, and I know I'm able to research, and I know I'm able to integrate this information in new ways, unique ways that I don't have to just sit and memorize by rote. Will a person even be able to be matzliach b'zman hazeh? If you put a person down and say, no, you have to ignore all that and sit here and just memorize things, and will he even be able to make it through the month doing that? Lav dafka. People might just get broken by the whole thing before they're ever matzliach, even by the definition that the Alter Rebbe set. So maybe to some extent we're all in the gather of Sevav or Sev Zayin. We're honest to some extent, or it's all takfa all of Mishnasa. It's too hard. It's all halachas chamuras to us. Maybe we can somehow shoehorn it into that hagdara. And on the other hand, let's say everyone actually does follow the Alter Rebbe. Let's say we have Kabbalah, so we're going to do what the Alter Rebbe says. Will there be any Rabbanim left? Will there be anybody who actually knows anything? Or we're all going to get stuck chazering things, right? The whole assumption that Rebbe is that there are people that are doing much better. Go'enim, Rabbanim, they're for sure going to be master Kol Torah. You have a problem, you're a shakchen. Okay, so don't worry, it's not your problem. You live your life and you learn what you need to learn. But what if even the biggest Bali Kishan today don't really have the ability, for whatever reason, to actually memorize Kol Torah Kul in the way the Alter Rebbe writes? So they should all be learning just a month's worth of material over and over again? Then we'll be left with nobody, with nothing. Someone who has a good memory in Torah nowadays is talking someone who remembers Shalei Be'erach more than other people, but still nowhere close to everything. And like I'm saying, if you actually enforce it, we might just equalize. So everyone will just be in the same boat. And then another point which one can make is that even the Metzius of Seforim has changed dramatically since the Alter Rebbe. Even just in the last 20 years. Right? The Alter Rebbe mainly is just focusing on the development of the Torah Sheba'al Peh is written. Right? Of course, a lot happened after that as well. Chiburim, manuscripts, printing, especially since the printing press. But even 100 years ago, we wind 100 years ago to a shtetl in Eastern Europe, right? Look at the descriptions. Did people have a bookcase at home full of Seforim? No. Sounds like each shtetl had one set of Shas in the shul, one Likutei Torah, and even in Kfar Chabad after the war, they say that you were looking for the Likutei Torah, you had to go to the Karasik's house because Rebbe's Karasik's wife was using the Likutei Torah. So you had to go chase her down to get her back. That's how things were as recently as then. So to what extent are Seforim integrated in your life? Not that much. They're around, they're there, but it's not behesek yad like that. And even if you had a library, even if a shtetl had a shtetl library in the shul, you know how many important Seforim were missing completely? They didn't have a single copy of altogether because they couldn't get it. And even a few dozen years ago, after the war, when everyone has their bookcases at home, but was it common for a good sefer, a chashuva sefer, an important sefer to just not be available? It was very common. You just can't find the sefer. I mean, maybe someone has it, but you have to, how are you going to find them? It wasn't easy to find things, find the people that have the seforim that you need either. Right? All of a sudden, in the last 20 years, you have this mitzvah where the whole concept of not having access has been almost completely obliterated. You have access to everything. And at the same time, also in the last 20 years, you have these incredible search capabilities which allow you to find things maybe faster than it would take for you to remember using just your memory alone. So these are other factors, again, not necessarily with big makaitis, but at least thoughts to keep in mind. So I saw someone's actually mitzayin on this topic. He was mitzayin generally that on this topic there's it's not such a well-known sefer, the kind that no one would have heard of or been able to find until the last couple of years. There's a sefer, Maseches Avos, called Pirush Ma'or Habonim, written by a Rav by the name of Rav Aryeh Mordechai Mirvis of Radin. I didn't have a chance to check if he's related to the chief rabbi. Might very well be. But he was a Rav in Radin. He printed the sefer in the Tafresh Tzadik Beis, 1932. It has a skamas, he's in Radin, he has a skamas from the Chafetz Chaim. Chafetz Chaim writes, Hirani, the Gaivad, the Hireinu, showed me the sefer, and the Chafetz Chaim says, I'm not endorsing the sefer, but I'm endorsing the man. I know he's a Rav going B'Torah V'Yira, Misride Der Hayashan. There's also a skama from Rabbi Chaim Oizer, who says, I did look in the sefer, and it's very good. So I looked in the sefer, and I found that he actually said many of these same ideas. On the Mishnah, Yachal Afil Takva Alav Mishnasoi, Eine Chayev Ad She'eshav Yasinim Ilibay. So he says, as he's already explained in the preceding passages, that you're mischayev b'nafshoi when you forget, and the forgetting shows that you don't care about it. You didn't bother remembering it. Right? Since it doesn't hold importance to you, so yeah, of course you forgot it. That's usually how memory works. If you remember the things that are important, then you forget the things that are not as important. But if it's takva alav mishnasa, if it's something else, and that's what caused it to be forgotten, then it's not your fault. And what's takva? So the way he defines takva is, it could be either at the beginning, you didn't chazard enough, because if you learn something once, no matter how into it you are, it's not likely you'll be able to remember everything that you just read. Number two, it could be that you learned too much, so it's just too information overload. Could also be that when you learned it, it wasn't so clear. You usually remember the things that are crystal clear to you. Things that are a little fuzzy, you're less likely to remember. And Takva al Mishnasa, he says, can also include if it was just very hard to chazer because of different problems in life, which the Alter Rebbe also already mentioned. So then he goes on and says like this: Luli de mistafina. If not for the fact that I was afraid, what I would say is as following. All these chiyuvim and Pirkei Avos, it also says you always have to be chazering different Torah non-stop, and if you stop and interrupt, harezim mischayev b'nafshay. B'derech, b'layla, b'suda, you forget something, all these mischayev b'nafshay mishnayos in Pirkei Avos. So he says, my theory is, is that this was only the chayiv before Taka Torah Shabbat Peh was written. You taka to be shayin and everything, shayin 40 to 101 times, maybe up to 400 times. That's v'shinantam mechudadim b'ficha, al tegamgem. So that's why you had to be chazering non-stop. Pashut literally begashmias. If you stop for a moment and you look at the field, boom, your memory, your whole the whole edifice collapsed. You were constantly had to run on the treadmill of memory to remember everything, or else. And now we have so many seforim, Torah Shabbat Peh, Kol ma shetamid vasik, ve'enei vasik, mechadish. It says, Kvar ein b'yochelis b'yad shum echad, leida, bal peh, Kol ma shechidshu, seforim b'sefreim, af mishan ezbarach b'zikaron toiv l'ma'oid, v'gam b'shkid nefla. No one is able to be lamed b'kulam. And then, fima shenismatu halavavis etzleinu. Sai the content, the quantity has taka ballooned already in 1932. And also nismatu halavavis etzleinu. At this point, if you just keep on reviewing things 400 times, you'll remain a total amaretz. So Mamela, you have no choice. Nishtana seder limud HaTorah etzleinu b'ofen acher legamrei. So by necessity, it transformed the Seder Limud HaTorah. You have to focus on whatever's negel l'maisa b'zman hazeh. Rak kadei shenuchal limtzoi ha'halacha b'mekayma. Just all our aspiration is that when the shaila comes up, I should be able to at least know where to look it up. That's taka what we can aspire to under today's conditions. Then I can look it up and see what the poskim hold. The gam b'chlal and other areas of Torah as well. Halacha, God, the midrash Torah, shelo yiyu muzarim lanu. They shouldn't be strange, right? You hear someone's chazering a medrash, and you say, "What? I never heard that before. That sounds so uncharacteristic almost. I never expected there to be a medrash that sounds like that." So that means you're a bit out of it. So we should at least nothing should be strange to you. And he mentions this word that in Gan Eden they'll remind you what you learned. The Alter Rebbe also mentions that, but only the Gabe going through Kol HaTorah Kula once, but he's applying it more. But it's not possible that Divrei Torah should be mechudadim b'finu ba'al peh. Everything from Chachmei Atalman ad Dereinu Zeh ad B'chlal. And he brings a marker for this in Hilchos Shchita. If you Mekayim what it says in Hilchos Shchita, it says in Yeridei Siman Aleph about the Sheikh has to know the halachas. But the Shulchan Aruch also says that if he says, "Al davar zeh hayisi mistapik v'shoyel," he says, I don't know the halacha, but I know enough that if it happened, I would know to ask. Call him, he's Yedei Hilchos Shchita. So that's halacha there. So chen davar etzleinu that even if you don't have to ask, if you're a chacham and you have to open a sefer in order to find the halacha, that's already a Yedea. That's our definition of Yedea nowadays, even though you're not Yedea Hadvarim al Peh. Mamela, he says, all these other Mishnayos following up as well. You don't have a chiyuv to be doing it non-stop according to his understanding, because even when we learn from a sefer. Can you walk down the street and have your nose in a sefer? Some people could do it. Most people, it's not practical. So Ibazoi, Hayais, the whole limud is from Seforim, and I'm not walking with the sefer. So that whole mission doesn't apply. If I'm walking down the street, I can say, Manoa Ilan Zeh. You should, to the extent that you can, you should speak about Torah and Yiras Shamayim, of course, in your spare time. And he says, I'm not here to be Mekel Ula Shel Torah, to put Torah down, fakart. I'm here to encourage, I'm here with a message of encouragement, because otherwise everyone is full of yiyosh and despair. We're all being over on Bittul Torah. And they told us, you're not supposed to be misyayish. Yiyosh and atzvus are very bad. He says, and I myself can tell you that I saw old veteran Rabbanim, it's not like the Rabbanim are doing any better. He says, trust me. So I'm here to pull away the curtain that's covering to expose the truth. Of course, if you can, then while you're walking, you should be Yosek and Torah. Now, this Nekuda that he mentions, Milchus Shchita, so you actually look in the Alter Rebbe as well, in that there in Siman Aleph. So when it says that it should be Shkurim B'fiv, Alter Rebbe interestingly says, Afal Pisha B'sh'ar Heirois, Ein Sarach Shieda HaMeira Bal Peh Kol Heirois. That's interesting. Alter Rebbe says that at least there in Milchus Shchita, the Meira doesn't have to know every halacha about Peh, he can look it up. The Chiddush was that really Milchus Shchita should be Shkurim B'fiv, because it's very important. Then there's this vart of, if you knew to ask, that's enough. And the Alter Rebbe says, gives examples of what we mean by that. What is something that the Sheikh has to know on the spot, and what are the things that the Sheikh has to know to ask? Gets into the details there. You have to know the Ikrei halachas. So you see this vart there in the Alter Rebbe Taka. It's Shulchan Aruch and the Alter Rebbe as well. And even here, we actually saw this lashon here in Siftes. Right there, when the Alter Rebbe was saying how you should learn, what you should focus on, the Alter Rebbe said that when you learn, it should be, because you can't ask the Rav of everything, so you see the Alter Rebbe is acknowledging even over here that there's some kind of limud in which doesn't mean you know what to do, but because you deal with them tchila, now you're yodea l'shoyel l'stapik. And you look there, Taka, in the Ashkenazi, and our 27 bays on Sif Zion. Maybe not Sif Test. So Rabbi Ashkenazi writes, Tzorech Iyun, or no, this is early in Sif Zayin, when the Alter Rebbe Taka lays out his Seder Limud for Shakchen. So Rabbi Ashkenazi says, Tzarech Yinam Seder Limud Zeh, Tzarech Liyas, Gam Kishoisik, Ba'alachas Atzrichas Lamaisa, of Sif Tes. Are you also over Mischayev B'nafshay if you don't do sufficient Chazal Halachas Atzrichas? If you do that, then you'll never know the Halachas Atzrichas Taka, this problem that we have, which is, can you even master the Halachas Atzrichas following the system? Or should we say, and use this idea and say, no, better to learn as much as you can, even if you don't learn them properly, and then you'll be mistapik v'shayel. Right? The Alter Rebbe did mention this musig here. And he mentions this a few more times in different places. So maybe we can combine, within the Alter Rebbe, we can combine these ideas and say, first of all, nowadays most people will never be able to finish even halachas hatzrichas, maybe even on the level of lishol l'stapik. Honestly, that would be nice if everyone would know every shayla to ask. That would also be nice. And Pashut, statistically, I'm assuming that the average yid in the shtetl had a harbe shayla once a year, a few times a year. And the amount of shaylas you can come up with in today's day and age on a daily basis from one thing to the next, it's a whole different level. So we take this concept, which has some basis in the Alter Rebbe, and we can combine it with the idea that we said earlier, the idea that the seforim are an extension of your zikarim, which also has perhaps certain basis in the Alter Rebbe. The question would be, why is the Seder Alibah in yeshivas still seemingly so out of whack with anything we're saying? So you could say that perhaps without this Yisoy, without this starting off with these years of Iyun, it could be that it's like you don't have any Havana at all. You need to have some basic Havana of how Torah works, and then you can learn the halachas hatzrichas. But just to go straight to the halachas hatzrichas, you'll be mamash na'ma'aretz, even what you think you know. And B'emes, if you look earlier in the Alter Rebbe in Perek Aleph, when it comes to teaching a child, the Alter Rebbe writes, when the Alter Rebbe said, B'zman hazeh, that it's all written, you don't have to teach Kolel Torah Sheba'al Peh the way they used to. What the Rebbe Lamed should do is, Yilamdanu lahav and Hei Teves b'talmud u'rev ha'mekaymis, gam b'halachos v'sugyas ha'amukos, imrev ha'paiskim mishenim ha'achareinim, v'yamidanu al iyan ha'alacha l'maisa, sheyuchal ha'ayim ba'atzmai lumid lahav v'lahiris, kol ha'alacha l'maisa, mitoich iyan b'talmud ha'paiskim mishenim ha'achareinim. And then the child can go and complete the Torah Kula on his own. So you see the Alter Rebbe somehow in Perek Aleph was saying that you should spend years learning Sugyas Be'iyim. And Rabbi Ashkenazi Taka has a ha'ara there in Perek Aleph, in Sifav, ha'ara 4 Gimel. Perek Beis, the Alter Rebbe started off and said that you shouldn't, if you're just learning Shlish, that does not include learning Be'iyim and being Mechadish. Right? That should be only after you complete Kol Torah. You should only focus on the halachas and matayim and derech tzara. And here in Perek Aleph, the Alter Rebbe is saying you should sit and learn sugyas b'iyah in yeshiva with the talmidim. The tzarech bir, by kasha. So maybe we could say either this idea that you need a certain basis, you need to have a certain kinyan in Torah, or else you'll just be completely mindless without understanding what's going on. Or you could say that the chinuch, the way the Alter Rebbe describes it, is built on the assumption that every child, at least potentially, can vaxois a gadol b'Yisrael. So the learning is geared towards that eventually. We're assuming you'll be the vaxois and a gadol b'Yisrael. So we're already starting now on the sugyas and giving you that yisoid in learning le'iyun, and then you'll fill out all the rest. We're hoping and assuming that you will be able to be matzliach. L'chayra, you should be able to tell pretty early on, at a pretty early age, whether a child has this potential or not. And l'chayra, then one ought to adjust the learning. L'chayra, interestingly, if you look in Perek Aleph, the Alter Rebbe doesn't seem to acknowledge this whole possibility. What if the child, Alter Rebbe talks about when he should start, if he's 4, 5, 6, 7, but once he's in cheder, the Alter Rebbe just assumes that he's learning sugyas b'iyim. No? I mean, even in the time of the Alter Rebbe, we know that not every child was capable of learning sugyas b'iyim. It's interesting. And so we could say, if this is Vartaka, the difference between Perek Aleph and Perek Beis, that when you're starting from a child, you do learn Be'iyun, so then you could say that as long as you're still in yeshiva, we're still striving, we're still aspiring to that maybe this will taka be matzliach. You'll taka learn Be'iyun, and then you'll be mashlim kol Torah kula. Only once you leave yeshiva and it doesn't happen, whoops, it didn't work out. But it's built on this assumption or this illusion that we're all, that's how yeshivas are kind of designed anyway. We know that people complain that yeshivas are built in the illusion that everyone just wants to learn Be'iyun all day. And there's other non-Torah explanations as to why yeshivas today are the way they are. And the question is, some people argue that maybe some bachrim ought to be learning a different seder limud that's more suitable to them. That's a different discussion. One more nakuda in the Alter Rebbe, there's a kuntras achanin, a long kuntras achan in the beginning of Perek Gimel about not getting married because it's going to affect the learning. There the Alter Rebbe seems to say something different about this whole Isser Shikchas HaTorah mitzvah. Here from Shulchan Aruch it sounded like it's mamish a mitzvah, it's mamish a lav. But there, the Alter Rebbe has to confront, the Rambam doesn't mention any of this stuff at all. So the Alter Rebbe says, Muzman Zagen, that there is no separate Isser. The mitzvah say the Talmud Torah kilchasa, the lav the shikcha him davar echel lefi das Rambam. Then Alter Rebbe says, Vashicheach machma she'enei chayzer limudei karoi. If you forget because you didn't chazer properly, maybe according to the Rambam, that would be included in takva of mishnasai. That the tak isn't your fault. Then Alter Rebbe says he doesn't want to say that in the Rambam. The zed doichik, because other Mefarshim seem to explain it differently. So his conclusion is, the Alter Rebbe says there is that there's taka no separate mitzvah, no separate avera. He says there's a certain chiyuv limud HaTorah. Chiyuv zehu mepi hashmo kachol din HaTorah shebal peh. Just like the shalish, where did the 333 come from? The 3/3. Kach kiblu chachamim biur mitzvahs van hagas halimud ish mipi ish, that you have to learn in this oifen. So the same goes for this as well. So Vishinantom is an asmachta, and Hishdalav Vishamar is an asmachta. It's all just Kabbalah Chachamim Ish Mipi Ish Tzarech Lisker Kol HaTorah. And that's why it's not in the Taryag. So it sounds like the Alter Rebbe is saying something a little different here. The Smak, Taka counted it to the Smak, argues in the Ram and holds the Deraisa. So first of all, we see the Alter Rebbe was actually open. At one point he writes it, Ozoi b'ni chusa, ha'shecheach machma she'eni chayz limudi karoi, ef sheda'am b'chlal takval mishnas b'das Ram. Doesn't seem to be the maskana though. But even on the continuation about the Rambam versus the Smak, according to the Rambam Kumtois, that it's not an assay, it's not a law, it's just Kabbalah ish mipiyish of the proper surah of limud HaTorah. So Rabbi Ashkenazi has a ha'ara there and says, Rabbi Zoi, does this bring into question the whole sifchas? Tzorichian. If sifchas stems with the kuntras achanim. If it's just Kabbalas Chachamim, so it was like the whole sifchas about the shakchem b'tivoi. Maybe the whole sifchas about shakchem b'tivoi is only according to the smak. You're taka being over and a lav d'iraisa. But if it's Kabbalas Chachamim b'seder al limud, then maybe the halacha should be that even if you're a shakchem b'tivoi, better to finish kol HaTorah kula than just sticking your whole life to the same monthly loop. So that's another factor to keep in mind here, that there's that kuntras achanim. So when we combine all of this, and I'm sure there's other halaras and other diyukim, so maybe we could sort of find some basis for what we began with, this idea that we can have a little bit more of an open mind about memory, storage, retrieval, according to the way the world works today. So Bazoi, Kumtois, back to our question for Hei Teves, it means that the fact that there are seforim does have a certain, the fact that we have seforim, maybe even to the extent that we have it today, taka does have an effect on the way this halacha works. Just like the Alter Rebbe was also made that it changed the kuf pa'amim, and it changed the way malanim teach their children. So Bazoi, maybe the Alter Rebbe would accept that also. Especially since we said that it's seemingly impossible anyway to do it the way the Alter Rebbe described it. Now, B'chal, this is all, I just want to clarify, this is all of the Alter Rebbe's shita, that there's a personal chiyuv. If you look in Sfarim outside of Chabad, you'll see that the way they always frame it is the Alter Rebbe versus Reb Chaim Volozhiner. Reb Chaim Volozhiner, it's a line, and the Velvel Brisker has an halachas on it, but basically the bottom line is it's a whole different understanding, which I alluded to earlier, which is that could be the Isser Shikchas HaTorah is only referring to the existence of Torah. Back when it was Baal Peh, if we didn't have an amazingly foolproof system to make sure that everyone remembered, that all the details were remembered, Torah would be forgotten. And that was the Isser. Once it was written down, according to Chaim Lashner and Velvel Brisker, the whole issue goes out the window because now it's on paper. It's not a chiyuv prati, it's a chiyuv klali. But a lot of people, there's a lot of discussions on that, but since it's not anywhere in line with, nowhere near in line with the Rebbe's Havanas, that's why we're not focusing on it. Just to conclude, I found the tshuva of the Kleisenberger. The Kleisenberger has a tshuva in Divrei Yatziv, Chelek Yeridei, Sim Kuf Lamed Hey, in Mutter Lumeid Harbe Kshein Zeicher. Tshuva from Mem Gimel. The Kleisenberger started Mifal HaShas, a system for chazening, acquiring bekiyos and mesachtes, getting verheard and getting prizes. So someone wrote that he's being matzliach Mifal HaShas, but he feels guilty because the Alter Rebbe says in Hilchos Talmud Torah that if you're going to learn it or forget it, you might as well not learn it. So he doesn't know if Mifal HaShas is the right thing for him to be doing. He wrote to the Kleisenberger himself. So the Kleisenberger says that's not only a question about Mifal HaShas, it's a universal question. Everyone has this problem. Everyone should be bli gimgum. Who can claim to achieve that? So we should only learn one perek and one mishnah. And Alter Rebbe himself says it. No, you have to be baki in the dvarim hanoigim l'maisa. All of that. He says, in order to know all of that, you need to learn lots and lots and lots of Torah, and even just learning the Kitzurim is not going to be enough for you. And he throws in a line, he says, V'yadua, what my Elta say, the Tzan Zerav told Gadol Echad, who wrote a Sefer Kitzur HaHalachas, Machmas Kvaydoi, Ein Ritzoni Laharach B'zeh. So, it wouldn't be a good share if we didn't get a little bit into some history, some who said what about who. So, I'll be megala to you who the Kleisenberger Rebbe is referring to. And it's referring to the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. There was a bit of a clash between the Divrei Chaim and the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. They both lived around the time of the Tzemach Tzedek, Rabbi Marash. If you look in Hei Teves Shem Tov, Volume 3, there's an article there about the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch and the Hasidic movement. And there's a section there on his connection with the Divrei Chaim. He wasn't a Chassidish himself, but there was a lot of interactions and connections. So he got Haskama on Teres HaZevach very early on from the Divrei Chaim. And he got Haskama from him on Lechem B'Simla, which we're learning here. Then, many years later, in Tavrish Chavdal, when he wanted to print Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, he requested a Haskama, and he got a no. Even after that, he got Haskama on Kesses HaSefer. So he was getting Haskamas on his Chashav Svarim. He didn't get one on the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. After the Divrei Chaim passed away, the Shlomo Ganzfried printed his Sefer Olei Shem on Shem is Gittin. Now there's also Divrei Chaim on Shem is Gittin. And he was masig. He quoted the Divrei Chaim, and he was masig on the Divrei Chaim a number of times, and dafka mit sharfkeit. And that caused a backlash. And there was a whole kuntris, almost a pashkavil, printed against him, called Mechemes Choiva, to answer back, to give him what he deserves. So in that kuntris, I think the second edition, there's a letter from Rav Shlomo Halberstam, the first Rav Shlomo Halberstam, the Einik of Divrei Chaim, the head of the Dovid dynasty. And he writes that right when I saw the Sefer, I saw the Hasagas, and I saw that the Hasagas were unfounded, they were baseless. And Kol Kavanasi Hoya Rak Lachlik, Ulahasig, Ulahatel Defi Bikachi Shemaim to be Pagea and the Tzanzer. And I know why. It's because when he sent the Sefer Kitzur Shulchan Aruch to the Tzanzer and he asked for Haskama, I remember that the Tzanzer told him no, and he told him, Shadai lanu ba'kitzurim, I'm going to finish in a minute, Shadai lanu ba'kitzurim, Sha'ad heina, U'ma lanu lahisif, Kitzurim ala kitzurim. And La'is, he opened up the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, and right where he opened, he showed him that this Tosim, Taka wrote things that are in the Shrichdik. So that's why ever since then he has Eva, V'chulu, and I was not down him the Kaf Schos. So ultimately he supports the counterattack on the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. So anyway, we see here this idea that even Kitzurim are not adequate. So how are you going to learn one parak your whole life? He says, look in the Alter Rebbe, in Halacha Ches, about the Shakchen that you should keep on learning. It doesn't make sense. You should learn one halacha your whole life. He says, what the Alter Rebbe calls a Shakchen is someone who can't remember Kol HaTorah Kula. You can only remember halachas and Ganegim L'maisa. What if we are laikim, lakui b'machlas hashikcha, that's what you're settling for? I can't reach that, I can't attain that level either. So Abazai, just do whatever you could do, b'shitchias, and you should be able to be mevarer and be me'ayin, etc. And he continues in this vein, but because we don't have time, we will end it here. Have a happy Chag HaSvarim, as we call it, and a good Shabbos.